There we go. So this statue, I'm curious if anyone has seen this statue before. Now, because the presentation is on, I can't see anyone else's cameras. So if you're raising your hand, I got nothing. But I suspect some of you have seen it before. It's one of my favorites. The first one, after it was sculpted and installed, it kind of became a bit of a viral sensation. And since then, it's been commissioned in one city after the next, to the point that now there's over 100 of these across multiple continents. At first glance, this looks like a standard bench with a bundled up figure laying across it. And you might just assume, oh, there's a person experiencing homelessness laying on that bench. And actually, a lot of people have made that assumption, for better and worse. And some have actually made phone calls to emergency services based on seeing this out in the cold. Infamously, in Ohio, about 20 minutes after this was installed at a local church, a neighbor called the police and said, there's a homeless man sleeping on the bench, come do something about it. 20 whole minutes. What I love about this statue is, if you see in the image that's on the bottom right, you look closely and you notice that on the feet that are dangling there, they bear the markings, those signature markings of the crucified Christ. The sculpture, it's known very simply as Homeless Jesus. The artist's name is Timothy Schmalz. And when he was asked what inspired him to create it, he said that it happened when one day he was out for a stroll and he saw basically this exact sight, a person who was bundled up for warmth and asleep on a park bench in downtown Toronto. And what came to mind in that moment to him was a very famous passage of scripture from Matthew 25. And that scripture tonight, is going to be the focus of our conversation. But just like last week, I hope that we can read it a little differently and maybe a little more deeply than perhaps we have in the past. You can go on to the next slide. Might be a little small for you, but I'll go and read it out. I just like to always have the text visible. So Matthew 25, verses 37 through 45. Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Then he will say to those at his left hand, you that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger and you did not welcome me, naked and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison and you did not visit me. Then they also will answer, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you? Then he will answer them, truly, I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. So for Christians who are like those of us gathered here tonight, who are have the strong proclivity, the strong commitment to justice and equity and making earth like it is in heaven, right? This passage is a bedrock for us. I know I've spent a lot of time wondering what our faith would look like if this passage were taught to us as foundational, as a cornerstone text. Here we go. I called this would happen.
Want to know what's in the mug?
It is chamomile tea with honey.
Oh, okay. That's not exciting. Go ahead.
No. All right, where was I? Oh, yes. I've spent a lot of time wondering what it would look like, what our faith would look like if this was taught to us as like a cornerstone text in the same way that something like John 3:16 or Romans 5:8 was. Because the claim Jesus is making here is a total paradigm shifter, that each and every vulnerable person you encounter is Christ himself, and that how we treat them not only affects their eternity, but ours. Because working in homeless services for as long as I have, it's this passage has always meant a lot to me, right? That every time I see an unhoused person, I'm seeing Christ himself. Now, last week I told you that one of the themes of our time together over these 3 weeks would be how I've actually learned to read scripture differently after spending so much of my time and so much of my life with people experiencing homelessness. And one of the key themes of Advent for me is stories being told upside down, stories that are being told from the perspective of the people who history usually forgets: unwed mothers, barren wives of temple priests, people from Nazareth, of all places. And this passage is one that I thought I had a strong sense of, right? That I'd gotten everything I needed to get out of it. But I do think that there is a deeper level that, again, until I was able to read it through the eyes of the people that Jesus is actually talking about, I wasn't able to really get all that's there. And it's a viewpoint that I only have access to because of that time spent. And even then it's limited in the ways that I will never and have never experienced it quite the same way. So most often I think that this passage is used to encourage Christians toward charity, toward volunteerism, and a general disposition of like kindness and goodness when encountering someone who is poor or someone who is experiencing homelessness. And we talked last week about how Jesus is calling us away from a model of charity and into a model of community, about how Jesus is calling us to relationships rather than transactions. And this week, I want to dig in a little more and kind of talk about the dynamics of those communities and the dynamics of those relationships. Namely, I want to talk about in those communities and in those relationships, who leads, who follows, who supports, who calls the shots, who has power, and who gets to talk for whom. And we absolutely have to spend some good time on this, because in doing homelessness work, getting this wrong has historically had catastrophic results. So we're going to start by talking about everybody's favorite topic, which is saviorism. Can I get a woohoo on that? So saviorism,
Woohoo!
yeah, there it is. Thank you. Saviorism is when someone enters into a situation where potentially some sort of help is needed or asked for, maybe, but does so with an overinflated sense of one's own importance, or perhaps entering it looking for the recognition or trying to be a hero, often, almost always, at the expense of the situation itself and at the expense of the people who are actually needing the support, right? And saviorism comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes, but if we're being honest, one of the most common shapes and sizes of saviorism is white Christians. Now, well-meaning, hearts in the right place, white Christians, of course, but white Christians nonetheless. And this is why it is so crucial to learn to read this passage well, because if the marginalized person is Christ himself, then we are not the savior in the story. And I do want to stop and point out here, I am not sitting here today telling you this as somebody who has always known this. And I'm certainly not telling you as someone who even gets it right to this day. Saviorism is a lot of what drew me to this work in the first place. It's a lot of what my early days in this work looked like. I had a lot of unlearning to do, and not all of it went very well. It's something that folks like me who have a lot of privilege and a lot of resources need to constantly confront. It's not something that you really get to the other side of. I don't think it's something that you're always dealing with. You're always sort of confessing. In fact, I had a really recent mess up where I had to stop and say, goodness gracious, Kevin, you're trying to make yourself the hero of this story. There was a big sweep here in Minneapolis, and we'll talk about sweeps a little more next week. If you don't know what a sweep is, it's when usually some combination of sanitation and police show up to an encampment and throw people's belongings away, and under the guise of cleaning that particular street. So there was a really large one that was not broadcast ahead of time, not called for, was really violent and destructive. And so I put on Twitter that it happened and asked for just some money to come in to be able to buy people some new belongings like tents and tarps and sleeping bags, because people weren't offered a place to go. There was no shelter beds in Minneapolis when this happened. So people were just stripped of, what little resources they had to get by. And so the money came in. It did really well. I was really grateful. And I got so excited to spend it because like, wow, ooh, this money came in. Yay, great. I get to like spend it and I get to take it to, the nonprofit. And I was looking on Amazon for some tents to buy, and tents can be pretty expensive. And I arrived on the cheapest tents possible, the cheapest ones known to humanity on Amazon.com. And I said, ooh, I could buy so many of these if I buy these super cheap ones. And my wife, who does a lot of really great on the ground work with encampments, said, don't get that brand. Everyone hates that brand. They rip, they break easily. And I completely ignored her. And I ordered so many of that. And my wife did exactly what she should have in that situation. When they arrived, she scolded the heck out of me and told me, what were you thinking? And I got defensive, of course. I thought about it and I realized, oh my goodness, I made myself the center of the story. My idea about buying the most and doing the best and the most good completely drowned out the voices of the people that it was supposed to be for. And I did exactly what I talked against in our talk last week. And I tried to give people the crappiest version of something just so that I could give out more. And I should know better. Like, I literally wrote the book on this stuff. My own need, though, to try and be clever and do the most, just overwhelmed in that moment. We sent them back. We got a refund. We got better tents. Don't worry. And I tell you this story not to minimize the role that I have or that we might have in helping and supporting, right? My access, your access, capacity, time, energy, and expertise are crucial in overcoming barriers. My access to my Twitter following made it possible to get the news out that this had happened, to bring money in and get these resources, right? It's not that I did not have a role to play, but I've had to learn that I can never mistake the role that I play or the skills that I can offer as more than what they are. And something I can never, ever do is leverage that position for power or control in the relationship. Because what happens when you have a bunch of people, especially often politicians, deciding what people experiencing homelessness need without actually talking to, or more importantly, listening to them, you get the situation that we're in now in most of our cities, right? And the situation that we have been for decades. And I'd love for us to look at an example, if we could pull the PowerPoint back up. This is just from a few short months ago out of Kansas City. And this is not to, oh, that's a great quote. Yeah, nothing for me. Yeah, the way I heard it was always nothing about us without us. Yeah. So yeah, this is not to blast Kansas City. This is absolutely the case in so many places. Back one more. That those arrows are part of a screenshot. They won't actually navigate you back. There you go. So, but this is one that was sent to me and from some friends that I have in Kansas City, and they said, "Hey, Kevin, we just came across this. Can you tell us what you think?" Let me see if I can make this a little bigger on my end. Here we go. So they sent this to me, and we're just going to dissect it because I think that it's very helpful to be able to look at plans and sort of tease through what is, maybe flowery or good sounding language around policy around homelessness, but there may not actually be any substance there. So this was a comprehensive plan called Zero KC. Now, right off the bat, it's a good name, right? Zero KC, and it's about homelessness. Are we going to make homelessness zero? Are we going to end homelessness? It's good language, right? On the right track. 5-year strategic effort. Okay, we're committed. This is a long haul. To end the growing problem of homelessness in Kansas City. That's my first stopping point, right? It doesn't say to end homelessness in Kansas City. It says to end the growing problem of homelessness. So are we ending what we consider the problem, or are we ending homelessness, right? So there's already a distinction maybe being made here. What is the problem of homelessness? It depends on who you talk to. So now we're a little wary now. And it says it consists of 4 key parts. So let's look at these parts. Go ahead to the next one. Number 1, create low barrier emergency shelters. So this means that the shelters that we do have, or any new ones that we make, we're going to remove the requirements and prerequisites for entry that often keep people stuck on the outside. Okay, this is a good thing. Like, if we have shelters, they should be low barrier. It should be easy to get in them. You shouldn't have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get a bed at a shelter. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about shelters later and how largely people who experience homelessness aren't big fans of shelters. One of the big reasons being that shelters don't actually end homelessness, right? If you are sleeping outside and then you go and sleep in a shelter, you are still homeless by any definition of that word. So that's another thing to note here so far. First step of this plan is not really doing anything to end homelessness. It is moving homelessness from one place to another, which may be beneficial to some, maybe not to others. But we've removed some barriers, so that's a good thing. Go ahead to the next one. Number 2, extreme weather plans. So on the days that get the hottest and on the nights that get the coldest, we're going to have an infrastructure that allows people to have a place to stay, to have some cooling centers, to be bussed around so that we can get where we need to go. Okay, I would say this is a good thing, right? Cities with inclement weather really need stuff like this. Again, we're not ending homelessness here. I would also suggest that this is a little bit bare minimum for any city that has inclement weather. We should have some sort of infrastructure so that the weather does not cause anyone to perish, right? So bare minimum, but I suppose this is a good thing. We'll move on to number 3, work program. So I do get a little suspicious anytime I see work programs kind of over highlighted. Now, we do need good jobs. We need good on-ramps for people to enter the workforce or re-enter the workforce. But work programs tend to get over talked about in homelessness because there's this idea that the way people are going to get out of homelessness is by just go get a job, when we know it's not that simple, right? For one, a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness are already part of the workforce. Additionally, we're just not having the right conversations around what types of jobs enable people to afford apartments. So there's a conversation there that usually doesn't become part of the conversation around people should get jobs, right? So, and when you look at this work program, you can see why there's room to be suspicious. When it comes down to it, their plan is to hire 15 unhoused individuals to help beautify the city, so pick up trash, and in the winter will assist with snow removal, so shoveling snow and picking up trash. These aren't exactly going to be high-paying jobs, I'm assuming. It says it will include job training and skill building. I suspect that just means we're going to make sure they show up on time and show them how to use a shovel and one of those little trash grabbers. We're not exactly preparing these 15 people for, the types of long-term employment that are going to result in apartments. And again, we're not even providing these 15 people apartments along with these jobs. So again, we're now 3 steps into a 4-step process, and we've not ended homelessness for anybody. And now let's get to number 4, which is my absolute favorite. The community needs assessment. So they say, over the past year, the city interviewed members of the community, including those experiencing homelessness and outreach workers, to ask what changes they want to see. Beautiful. This is great. This is exactly what we're talking about, right? Nothing about us without us. Bring people experiencing homelessness to the table, ask what they need, and see what they say. Ideas included more affordable housing infrastructure, housing for youth, LGBTQ folks, housing for adults with children, better personal hygiene facilities, and much more. And that's the end of the slide. And that's the end of the plan. So essentially, what this slide says is, we asked people what they needed, and they said housing. We resolved to keep asking. And so we have a 4-pronged plan that has not done anything on this slide that reflects what people have said that they need and what they want. And that is Kansas City's 0KC plan to address the problem of homelessness, right there, coming at it from 4 prongs that essentially do nothing to end homelessness. They just move it around. So treating the unhoused person as Jesus means really doing this 4th step, but doing it right. Listening to people, and then doing what this 4th step misses, taking what they say seriously, like we would if they were Jesus. I mean, could you imagine telling Jesus to pull himself up by his own bootstraps or sandal straps, whatever they are? Get a job. Weren't you a carpenter at some point? Go make a table or something. Of course not. We would probably ask Jesus what happened that he ended up in this situation and what we can do to alleviate it. Similarly, can you imagine coming up to Jesus on the park bench and saying, okay, Jesus, I see that you need some help. So here's what we're going to do. Step 1, come with me right now in this van. Step 2, pee in this cup so we know that you're not on drugs. Step 3, come stay at this shelter for 6 months while we decide if you're good enough for housing. I hope that's not how we would treat that person if they were Jesus. So why are those 2 the most common responses to homelessness, right? This is largely what we do in our systems. And ultimately, I think it's because we think that we know best. We think that we are the savior in the story. We think that we're the ones that are here to do the good. One time I was at a community meeting in Los Angeles, and a group of service providers and city workers were coming together to talk about a particular encampment that was getting a lot of attention. A lot of local businesses were noticing that it was growing. It was next to the 101. It was on 101 Hollywood Boulevard, very popular destination for tourists. So we're all coming together. We're talking about, okay, what's going on with this encampment? And a couple of police officers spoke up and said, oh, that group, they don't want help. And so we kind of stopped and we asked, well, what do you mean they don't want help? And they said, oh, well, we went to that encampment and we offered everyone there shelter beds, and they all said no. And then they used the 2 most dangerous words in my line of work: service resistant. They called them service resistant. I wonder if anyone here has used or heard that phrase used before. Maybe not necessarily in that terminology, but I'm sure you've all heard about the quote unquote homeless who don't want help.
They don't want help. Yeah.
Or who quote unquote just want to be homeless. Maybe you've heard all homeless people described that way, or maybe it's been used to categorize as though, well, there's this group of unhoused people who just want to stay that way. They just want to live off of charity, and they want to beg for everything. But then there's this other group over here who we really need to help because they're the ones that actually want it, right? And once again, though, it's if every unhoused person was Jesus, I don't think we would dismiss them that easily. Because with a few questions, and preferably with an established relationship and rapport with a person, you can dig a lot deeper and find out that there's a lot more to the story. So, for example, the encampment that I was telling you about, the one that the police called service resistant, what if I told you that the shelter that they were being offered was actually several towns over, 17 miles away? We're talking 17 LA miles in a totally different community, a community where they don't know where meals are. They don't know where to go to get clothes. They don't know where they're allowed to be during the day, because this is the type of shelter that would open at 7 p.m. and kick you out at 7 a.m. and you can't come back till 7 p.m. again. So people are essentially being asked to get into a squad car and be taken 17 miles away, only to be kicked out at 7 a.m. with nowhere to go and no idea what to do. I think we should also take into account in this story who was making the offer. Does this encampment have much reason to trust the LAPD? Would you accept an undesired offer or an undesirable offer from the same people that wrote you multiple tickets for having a shopping cart or having a tent set up in the last week? Would you feel comfortable getting into a squad car and actually believing that you're not being hauled off to jail? And we've not even touched the sorest subject of them all, which I referenced earlier, shelters. And that's by and large, unless the weather makes it completely unbearable, people don't like going into congregate shelters. I don't even like going into congregate shelters. The times that I've had to go get paperwork or pick someone up or meet a case manager, I can't wait to get out of there. Congregate shelters, especially these last few years, as we recognize the dangers of congregate settings in a pandemic, shelters are not desirable places to go. Some are better than others. Some are more humane and dignified and hygienic, not to cast aspersions on every shelter ever, but by and large, the reputation of shelters among people experiencing homelessness it's not positive. And so the no that these officers received could have come from any one of these reasons, or possibly a dozen more. And they had nothing to do with whether or not they actually wanted help or that they preferred to, quote unquote, just be homeless. And what comes next, once people get that label of service resistant, people get discarded, dismissed. They get labeled in such a way that we justify criminalizing them, jailing them. We say they don't want help. And so whatever we want to do on that corner, whatever we want to do to that encampment is totally justified because we offered them something, right? And they didn't take it. They don't want help. And it's all because we're too stubborn to actually ask good questions. The truth is, honestly, if people would rather sleep on the sidewalks than accept my help, I think that says a lot more about me and the help that I'm offering than it does about them. Maybe they're saying no to the rules that come with the program being offered. Many shelters have curfew policies, like I described, or they don't let you stay past a certain time. People can't actually sleep in them because of noise. Maybe they're saying no to me. Maybe they don't trust me. Maybe they don't know who I am. Why would they get into my van to take them somewhere if I've not built that relationship and rapport? Maybe the last person that did build that relationship and rapport let them down, and they're not ready to take that leap again. I've seen so many programs and so many case managers let people down time and time again. I've seen golden housing opportunities taken away over technicalities or last minute funding changes. You were hearing a story from our friend John as you logged in today of somebody who just fell through the cracks, that through no fault of her own was stuck in a system over administration error. That stuff happens all the time. And then we wonder why people are hesitant to say yes to help, to accept those resources when it comes. Typically, that no has a history, it has a story about which we really know very little. What I'm offering, the way I'm offering, in some way isn't matching their needs. And usually it's because I never bothered to ask them what those needs were to begin with. Because in all my years of working in homelessness services, having met thousands and thousands of people experiencing homelessness, I have never once met a truly, truly service resistant person. I've met people who did not want to talk to me, who cursed me out, who told me to go to hell, and any number of other things when I've offered them a particular resource or even just tried to introduce myself. But never once have I formed a relationship with somebody whose true, authentic desire was to live on the streets and survive day by day on charity and luck. That person is somebody I have never met. And I think that we would all know that, if not intuitively, but relationally, if we actually believed that each and every person experiencing homelessness was Jesus. If we understood that the true call of this passage, the true scandal of this teaching, is that not only are we called to be kind and to offer help, but that we're called in many ways to sit at their feet, to listen, to learn, and to be changed ourselves, not to seek to transform, but to be transformed. It makes me think of the Magi in the story of Christmas who come to find Jesus and simply offer their gifts. They knew they were in the presence of something that was so much bigger and greater than themselves. They offered their gifts and their guidance to not go back the way that they came so that they could avoid Herod. They have a very critical role to play in the story, but they were not the saviors of the story. They are not the center of that story. If we could return to that last slide, the statue is my absolute 100% most favorite thing about this statue. It's more prevalent in some versions and kind of depends on the angle. It really shows up in this one. And that's that the bench leaves just enough room for any one of us to find our proper place in that story, to sit right there at the feet of Jesus. Maybe it's to attend to some needs, but mostly I think it's just taking a posture of listening, which for me is a posture of prayer. At this point, we can go ahead and move to our breakout rooms.
All right. Let me just check that. Make sure we've got everybody here. Okay, so you're going to be out for about 18 minutes, folks. It'll automatically count down and come back. And then we're going to prepare any questions you have to put in the chat, and Rob Henderson will curate those for us and present them to Kevin. So we look forward to seeing you on the other side. Sake of putting it online. And Rob Henderson there, the beautiful, resplendent, incredible man that he is going to curate this. We'd love to see your questions in the chats so that Rob can put those to Kevin. So get on that right away. And it's over to you, Rob.
Good. Thanks, buddy. Yeah, type them in there, folks, and we will shoot some off to Kevin. Kevin, I just want to say we were appreciative when our group when you were talking about your experience with the tents and ordering the tents, and talking about saviorism, and for me too, it reminded me, when one of the questions we had for discussion was, where have we seen or experienced saviorism? And well, you know what? It's often just looking in the mirror, because there's oftentimes for those of us that are in the church and serve and are there we would just want to help and make the world better and make it more about what God's dream is, that we can fall into that. And so to be able to identify when we're doing it to be better later is important. And thank you for being open about sharing that, because
Of course.
yeah, woke us up a bit. So one of the questions from Judy is, how can we approach the issue of drugs and mental illness? Yeah, that's one that definitely gets talked about a lot. And that,
Yeah.
how do we deal with that?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I give 3 chapters of it to it in my book, and I would give it more if they'd
Mm.
let me. At the same time, I'm careful not to overstate those points either, because something that can very easily happen is people say, oh, everyone who's on the streets is crazy or on drugs.
Mhm.
And that's just not true. The data, every time we do it, does not bear that out. Now, people who experience homelessness have overrepresented mental illnesses and substance use disorders, right? So it's not that these things are not related and not overlapping, but it's important too that we talk about what that relationship is. So for example, with mental illness, we recognize that mental illness and homelessness overlap, not because mental illness causes somebody to, decide, what, I'm going to go sleep outside today. Or mental illness does not cause somebody to take their lease and rip it up and go to Walmart and buy a tent, right?
Mhm.
Mental illness leads to homelessness because there is not a robust system of care, and I'll speak especially in the US, for people who are suffering with mental illness.
Right.
So mental illness is a risk factor for homelessness because housing is not accessible for people who have severe mental illness.
Right.
The same is true with drug addiction, right? People don't do drugs and suddenly go, you know what? Houses are for losers. I'm going to go sleep outside,
Yeah.
right? Something I'll say too is that there is sort of this narrative that people get hooked on drugs, use all their money, and so then they can't afford rent, right? And I have heard stories like that, but more so, way more common is people who begin to use drugs or amplify their drug use significantly once they start experiencing homelessness.
Right.
The drug use is a way of coping with homelessness.
Yeah.
So in terms of what do I do with those? I mean, I treat people, and housing as an intervention for all of these things is a very successful intervention. People
Right.
who are experiencing mental illness on the streets who then get housing show a decrease in the negative symptoms of their mental illness.
Right.
They show an increased ability to get help, to get on medication, to make appointments to see doctors. Same with substance use. We see substance use goes down when people feel safe and feel secure in their housing, and they're more likely to ask for help, and they're more likely to keep those appointments. They're more likely to get that help in housing.
And yeah, I'm pushing back on those narratives, like you say, that just aren't true. That when Kevin and I interviewed you on our podcast a couple of months ago, the one thing you said that stuck out to me that I always remember was, people say, people on the street or that experiencing homelessness, why do they spend their money on drugs and this kind of thing? But it's, we ever think that, well, people take drugs because drugs work,
Yes.
and they're in an immense amount of pain and distress and discomfort. And I just kind of let that sit with folks, but I thought that was powerful too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another helpful resource someone's mentioning is a website called 12neighbors.com, a community addressing homelessness through tiny homes in New Brunswick. I don't know if the tiny homes thing is something that's taking place in Minneapolis. Have you had experience with that? I've seen that.
Not in Minneapolis, but elsewhere I've seen it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Do you think wraparound services need to be part of any homelessness plan? Yeah, it sure seems that way. That's what
Yeah,
we're
I would
advocating
say
for.
that I don't want to say any homelessness plan because, well, any broad homelessness plan, absolutely. But I've met a lot of people who, do not need like permanent wraparound services as part of their plan to address their homelessness. Some people literally just need $500 to make a security deposit and
Yeah.
then they're good, right?
Right.
So
Right.
we can be judicious in our resources there, but absolutely. I mean, that's what supportive housing is it's housing plus supportive services that are offered constantly, that are brought straight to people. Wraparound services. Fantastic.
Yep. And Julie mentioning something in her group they shared this idea of being able to speak to someone and using language around feeding you or dining with you, which is thinking about relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was really good. From John, saviorism in my case is often manifested by my being upset when someone I'm helping, I think, refuses my help.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's very true too.
Absolutely.
Gabrielle, our group discussed how in healthcare, homeless patients are labeled non-compliant,
Yeah.
which is similar to service resistance.
Mhm.
However, some medication needs to be taken with a meal. What do you do if you don't know what and if you'll eat that day, right? Or the person that needs to change the dressing on their wound and clean it regularly, they're labeled, but their challenges are not understood. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I've seen, unhoused people be uh, given medication that has to be refrigerated, and,
Right.
and
Yeah.
when there were versions of that medication that didn't, and maybe it was the doctor, or maybe it was the insurance would cover the one and not the other, and it's
Right.
more of a American problem.
Right.
But yeah, see that all the time. People discharged to the streets with no real plan, to the extent that at this point, one of the most interesting trends in America is healthcare companies getting into the housing game, actually buying up housing, or insurance companies actually attaching housing case management to insurance, because I think medical groups more and more are recognizing that housing is a medical issue, that it's a public health
Right.
issue, right? And they're sick of, getting their patients started on some kind of care and then sending them to the streets where it's completely impossible.
Yeah. One of the questions we had for discussion was, do people experiencing homelessness have a voice or a say in the policies and programs for addressing homelessness? And what we talked about a little bit was in general, that those that are on the streets and living unhoused don't yet. It seems to be the ones that are getting the message out are those that will advocate for them. And how we as a church and as followers of Jesus need to have those voices to step in to the gaps and make these things known. And we had an example of in London, I think we told you about this, where a gentleman was camped out in front of City Hall for a while, not eating, just to bring attention and forcing a discussion to happen between people at City Hall and politicians. And so I just wonder, Kevin, you could speak about that advocacy voice for those that just do not have a place to go to have their voice heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a crucial role that the church can play, and why I advocate so much for relationships and community, because our systems do and will continue to make it so that the voices of people experiencing homelessness will not be heard and will not be brought to the table. And so that's a way that, again, that we can do good work without being saviors, because we can leverage our voice and our privilege to bring those voices to tables, rather than speaking over them or speaking for them, unless of course we're repeating what they said, in which case we in some cases have to speak for them because they're not allowed to speak, right? But that's different than speaking for them in a different way.
Right. All right.
There was a question up
Yeah.
a little further that I thought was really interesting. The one by
Did I
Tana.
miss one here.
It's under Judy's question. Starts with another question is similar.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, I missed that one. Another question similar. How do we deal with bad behavior that violates the community? Yeah.
Yeah, this is so good because this came up a lot in my work, right? Because we were the type of place, we were low barrier, which meant that you were allowed to come in if you were drunk. You were allowed to come in if you were high. You were allowed to come in if you were, a bit belligerent. We didn't demonize behavior. We certainly didn't demonize, substance use. But where the standard that we always set was safety. We didn't say, are you drunk? We didn't say, are you high? We said, are you safe? Because I've met lots of people who, can be hammered drunk and they're just going to go be quiet and do their thing in the corner. And I've met other people who are completely sober and absolutely not safe that day to be around.
Yeah.
And a big piece of that is also evaluating it by the day. Something we would often say to people is like, hey, today's not a good day. Seems, and again, we're addressing behavior, right? But we're not assigning worth or goodness or badness to the person based on the behavior, right? We're saying today is not a good day. Let's try again tomorrow. Or maybe would you consider taking a walk around the block, taking a few deep breaths and trying again? Because ultimately, a phrase that we use often with trauma-informed care is like bad days, not bad people. So absolutely, there's behaviors that harm the community. And I think, again, that's the language that we use is not, why are you doing this bad behavior, you bad person? Get with it. It's, hey, what you're doing is having an impact on those around you. And we are here for the flourishing and the safety of everyone. So how can we work together to make sure your needs are being met while also keeping everyone safe?
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Again, Nancy reminding us nothing about me without me needs to be the mantra. Yeah. Yeah. That's perfect. Any other questions, folks, that anybody wants to throw in there? Feel free.
Well,
We're getting quiet.
that's okay. It's 3 minutes to 9. I think that
Oh, okay.
there's lots to process, So thanks, Robin. And thank you, Kevin. Again, just to remind folks, if you've not had a chance to pick it up, I'll do the shameless plug and say, go buy the book. It's called Grace Can Lead Us Home, a Christian Call to End Homelessness. And it's written by the incredible Kevin Nye, who's back with us for yet another week. And you can let your friends and family know that it's not like The Young and Restless. If you missed last week, you can join next week and still get something out of this. So, or Days of Our Lives, or is Another World still on? I don't think it's still on. I think Another World is coming, but anyway, Mac and Rachel Corey are the two. But anyway, that's another story for another day. Valerie, let me turn this over to you.
Yes, sir. All right. Well, maybe a final blessing, if I might. So in this Advent season, as we leave our time together, may we learn to be people of love, making space for love to live in our hearts and to learn how to better to live out of that love in all that we do and say. May the blessing of God, the Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, be with each of us this day, with those you hold in your heart, in your prayers, and in your work. Amen.
Amen.
Blessings all.
Blessings all. Thank you all. Thank you, Kevin. Good night.
Thank you all so much.
Hasta luego.
Good night.